The most profound and perilous miscalculation of Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez's entire political trajectory did not transpire during the winter month of February in the year 2026, when she stood before an esteemed assembly of foreign policy intellectuals at the Technical PT, University of Berlin, and erroneously suggested that the nation of Venezuela was situated below the equator. This was a geographical assertion regarding a country that rests unequivocally within the Northern Hemisphere, a foundational geographic reality that practically any diligent student graduating from the rigorous international relations program at her alma mater, Boston University, would undoubtedly recognize. Furthermore, this critical error in judgment did not occur in the early autumn of 2021, when she made a highly publicized entrance at the exclusive Met Gala. On that glittering evening, she crossed the threshold wearing an immaculate, custom-tailored white designer gown, elegantly emblazoned with a provocative economic slogan concerning taxation. Stepping confidently into an opulent ballroom where the absolute minimum price for admission stood at $35,000, attending as the distinguished personal guest of a legendary fashion magazine editor. Nor did her ultimate misstep take place in the year 2019, a period during which her political campaign apparatus authorized the expenditure of $29,000 strictly on commercial air travel over a remarkably brief 3-month window. Ironically, during the precise time frame in which she was passionately introducing sweeping legislative proposals meticulously designed to combat a global climate crisis that is exacerbated by, among numerous other industrial factors, the heavy carbon footprint of commercial aviation. Rather, the single most dangerous and consequential mistake that Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez ever committed was crossing the threshold of a solemn House Oversight Committee chamber on a crisp morning in March of 2026 and proceeding to articulate her opening arguments before Representative Mike Johnson had even been given the opportunity to vocalize his own, meticulously prepared inquiries. She had navigated this precise legislative theater on countless previous occasions. Indeed, she was widely regarded as the most uniquely talented individual within the entire congressional body. At commanding such high-stakes environments, the imposing wood-paneled hearing room functioned essentially as her natural ecological habitat, a space perfectly outfitted with an array of television cameras, highly sensitive microphones, an attentive national viewership waiting with bated breath, and, inevitably, a partisan adversary perfectly positioned for her to rhetorically dismantle. Over the span of 8 transformative years, she had meticulously perfected the modern political art form of transmuting standard congressional committee hearings into immensely viral digital content, effortlessly converting routine bureaucratic confrontations into highly lucrative fundraising appeals and masterfully shaping every single critique leveled against her into an empowering continuation of the central narrative, the compelling story of a fiercely determined working-class young woman from the vibrant neighborhoods of the Bronx, who steadfastly refused to be intimidated or silenced by the entrenched elite. What she completely failed to realize on that fateful morning, however, was that Mike Johnson, the seasoned representative hailing from the state of Louisiana, had dedicated the entirety of the preceding 3 weeks to thoroughly absorbing the contents of a seemingly mundane 26-page bipartisan ethics document. She remained entirely unaware of the specific, crucial detail he had quietly discovered, nestled within the text on page 14. And crucially, she had absolutely no inkling of the precise philosophical question he was preparing to ask her. The atmosphere inside the House Oversight Committee chamber on the morning of March 17, 2026, crackled with the highly specific, palpable electricity of a grand room where two entirely distinct proceedings were quietly occurring at the exact same moment. There was, on the surface, the official scheduled proceeding concerning standard congressional ethics reform. And then there was the unspoken underlying proceeding which absolutely every seasoned journalist seated in the elevated press gallery inherently understood was dedicated to something far older, much more profound, and infinitely more personal in its scope, contradicted. The official, heavily documented subject of the gathering was the Restore Trust in Congress, an earnestly crafted piece of bipartisan legislation, specifically designed to permanently prohibit elected members of the federal legislature, along with their immediate family members, from engaging in the active trading of individual corporate stocks. Representative Ocasio-Cortez proudly served as a primary co-sponsor of this legislative endeavor, and she had been formally invited by the committee to deliver passionate testimony advocating for the bill's swift passage. Seated alongside three other distinguished legislative colleagues from across the political spectrum who had similarly championed identical transparency reforms over the years, yet the true unspoken subject, lingering heavily in the conditioned air of the room, was a deeply philosophical question that had been steadily accumulating weight and momentum for 8 consecutive years. Ever since, an energetic former bartender from the Bronx had spectacularly unseated a powerful 10-term incumbent and arrived in the nation's capital, carrying a personal narrative that was fundamentally unlike anyone else's within those marble halls. This particular question had never actually been articulated directly to her face. Rather, it had merely circled her formidable public persona for nearly a decade, manifesting subtly within lengthy magazine profiles, quietly threading through critical opinion editorials, and existing within that specific genre of cultural criticism that naturally attaches itself to any public figure whose entire professional brand is deeply predicated upon their unwavering authenticity. However, despite all the whispers, the question had never managed to land squarely and clearly inside a brightly lit room filled with high-definition cameras, directed toward a sworn witness sitting rigidly under the solemn oath of truth. Mike Johnson arrived at exactly 38 minutes past the hour of 9 in the morning, taking his designated seat at the elevated dais. With a quiet, deliberate lack of ceremonial fanfare, as the acting Speaker of the House, he was, quote, not technically or legally obligated to maintain a permanent seat on this specific oversight committee, but he had quietly arranged to participate in this particular session by utilizing the distinct kind of nuanced procedural flexibility exclusively available to powerful legislative leaders who intimately understand how to quietly maneuver the intricate levers of institutional authority. He placed a single unremarkable manila folder down upon the polished wooden table in front of him. Securely contained within that completely solitary folder rested exactly 26 printed pages, every single word of which he had methodically read and digested no fewer than 4 separate times. Representative Ocasio-Cortez made her highly anticipated entrance at 9:51. Gliding into the chamber, completely enveloped by the smoothly practiced protective formation of a deeply experienced congressional staff that had thoroughly learned over the course of 8 intense years, in the eject's public eye, exactly how to make a highly choreographed entrance appear entirely effortless and spontaneous. She was elegantly adorned in a sharply structured professional blazer, clutching a finely crafted leather portfolio, and she navigated the crowded physical space of the room, exuding the absolute unshakable confidence of a powerful individual who had performed this exact routine vastly more times than she could ever accurately count. And importantly, an individual who had emerged victorious from these skirmishes vastly more times than she had ever tasted defeat. She offered a polite, knowing nod to her fellow Democratic colleagues, seated along the polished witness table, gracefully received their affirming nods in return, and comfortably assumed the designated position in the spotlight. She did not at any point direct her gaze upward toward Speaker Johnson. Concurrently, Johnson purposefully did not lift his eyes from the surface of the manila folder resting before him. The presiding chairman officially called the highly anticipated hearing to order, methodically reciting the standard procedural remarks, outlining the noble public purpose of the session, and offering a gracious acknowledgement of the genuinely bipartisan nature driving the ethics reform effort, specifically noting the great significance of having a legislative member as nationally prominent and culturally influential as Representative Ocasio-Cortez willingly testify in fierce support of the proposed transparency measures. Representative Ocasio-Cortez has formally requested the opportunity to deliver an opening statement to the committee. The chairman announced, his voice echoing through the chamber. "The committee will hear from you now." She perceptibly straightened her posture, projecting a commanding physical presence. She had been meticulously preparing, revising, and rehearsing this exact statement for the better part of 10 continuous days. "I wish to begin my time today by stating something that might genuinely surprise the people sitting in this room," she boldly declared, casting her gaze around the silent chamber with the smoothly practiced ease of a brilliant orator who fundamentally understood that the opening sentence of any rhetorical address was always the most structurally critical element. "I am absolutely not sitting here today because my own personal or political record is entirely flawless. Rather, I am sitting here before you because the analysis process in institutional system we operate within is deeply broken, and fundamentally broken systems possess no inherent capacity to magically repair themselves." She leaned forward slightly, closing the physical distance between herself and the microphone to create an atmosphere of profound intimacy. "I have proudly served in the United States Congress since the year 2019, a period spanning 7 eventful years. Throughout that extensive duration, I have watched with growing dismay as my esteemed colleagues positioned on both sides of the partisan aisle actively trade financial stocks in the very same corporate entities that they are legally tasked to regulate. I have watched them graciously accept lavish gifts from the powerful industries they are supposed to oversee, and then I have watched them confidently stand behind elegant podiums and passionately assure their struggling constituents back home that they are tirelessly fighting every single day for the dignified, working people of this great nation." She allowed a heavy, dramatic pause to settle over the quiet room. "I eagerly co-sponsored this vital piece of legislation precisely because I deeply believe, no, because I absolutely know with every fiber of my being that the beautiful people I have the profound honor to represent, the resilient people residing in the working-class neighborhoods of the Bronx and Queens, fundamentally deserve elected representatives who are not quietly enriching their own personal financial portfolios at the private public's steep expense. They richly deserve dedicated advocates who intimately understand exactly what it feels like to nervously check the balance of a bank account before daring to purchase weekly groceries, advocates who understand the suffocating quiet terror of deeply worrying about how to afford the monthly rent, advocates who thoroughly comprehend entirely, because they have physically lived through it themselves, exactly what the vast echoing distance between the insulated halls of Washington and the harsh realities of everyday life actually feels like. I personally grew up within a loving family where that specific socioeconomic distance dictated absolutely everything about our existence. My mother worked tirelessly, cleaning other people's homes to make ends meet. My father laboriously drove a public school bus, before eventually managing to build a very small, fragile architecture business. We ultimately made the difficult decision to move our family away from the Bronx and relocate to Westchester simply because my devoted parents deeply believed that securing a more affluent zip code would inherently translate into accessing a superior educational environment for their children, and history proved that. They were entirely correct in that assessment. They willingly sacrificed absolutely everything they possessed to make that critical upward mobility a tangible reality. I closely watched them endure those sacrifices every single day. I thoroughly understood, long before I ever possessed the capacity to understand anything else regarding the complex world of national politics, that, within the borders of America, the foundational rules of the game are simply not applied equally to everyone, that profound lived understanding is the exact reason why I eventually chose to run for public office. That unyielding understanding is the precise reason why I am sitting before this committee. Today, I am here not because I have always managed to execute every single decision perfectly, because I most certainly have not, but entirely because the beautiful, struggling people of my home district purposefully sent me to this city to forcefully hold entrenched power accountable, particularly when holding that power accountable proves to be deeply uncomfortable, particularly when it proves to be highly inconvenient. And yes, even when the power that must be held accountable happens to be myself. She gracefully leaned back into the comfortable leather of her witness chair. The Democratic committee members seated around the dais were visibly nodding their heads in deep, rhythmic agreement. The packed public gallery radiated the specific, highly receptive stillness of a captivated audience that has just been delivered. The exact, soaring rhetoric they had traveled great distances to hear. One of her dedicated staff members, standing quietly along the perimeter wall, allowed herself to release a very small, barely perceptible exhale of profound professional satisfaction. I am now fully ready to answer your questions, the representative concluded. At that exact moment, Mike Johnson quietly set down the fine ink pen that he had been loosely holding between his fingers for the preceding 4 minutes. Without ever actually writing a single word, he directed his gaze smoothly across the room until his eyes locked firmly onto hers. I sincerely thank you for delivering that passionate statement. Representative, he offered in a remarkably even tone. I do have a few specific inquiries I would like to explore. He slowly flipped open the cover of the manila folder. Exactly 3 weeks earlier, on a remarkably quiet Saturday afternoon, inside his spacious, sunlit office located deep within the United States Capitol, Mike Johnson had received a highly confidential document from the House Ethics Committee via a secure encrypted email server, and he had subsequently sat down at his desk to quietly read it. He had not, in truth, been actively searching for this specific document at all. The comprehensive report had initially been released to the general public on the 25th of July in the year 2025, and he had merely noted its bureaucratic existence in passing at that specific time. It outlined a decidedly bipartisan finding, concluding that Representative Ocasio-Cortez had technically violated the strict internal House gift rules in direct connection with her highly publicized attendance at the 2021 Met Gala, resulting in an administrative order, requiring her to promptly make approximately $3,000 in retroactive additional payments to various service vendors, after which the legal matter was officially considered entirely closed and resolved. He had merely noted this development in the exact same fleeting manner that an experienced politician notes 1,000 other transient things occurring within the chaotic ecosystem of Washington as a minor, isolated data point to be quietly filed away into the archives and immediately moved past. What ultimately compelled him to actively retrieve the document from the digital archives. Once again, a mere 3 weeks prior to this monumental hearing, was a single, seemingly innocuous sentence buried deep within a routine, daily news story covering the upcoming ethics reform bill. A seasoned political reporter had sharply noted, employing the highly specific, wry journalistic economy, exclusively possessed by veteran writers who have covered the inherent contradictions of Washington long enough to deeply appreciate profound political irony, that one of the new legislation's most vocal and prominent co-sponsors had ironically herself been the central subject of a formal ethics ruling less than 1 calendar year earlier. Intrigued by this framing, Johnson had purposefully pulled up the 26-page PDF report later, that quiet evening, and commenced reading. He finally arrived at the text on page 14 at approximately 9 o'clock at night. He meticulously read the relevant paragraph twice over, and then, seeking absolute clarity, he read it a third consecutive time. Following this, he gently set the printed report down upon his desk and sat perfectly still in his cavernous office for several long minutes, staring softly at absolutely nothing in particular, turning over the profound implications of what he had just absorbed. The paragraph in question clinically described the precise chronological timeline of financial payments dispatched to various vendors directly related to Representative Ocasio-Cortez's attendance at the extravagant Met Gala. It dryly noted that multiple independent working professionals, the talented designer who crafted the dress, the dedicated stylist who curated the look, the everyday driver operating the car service, had simply not received their rightful financial compensation for their hard labor until long after the official Office of Congressional Conduct had formally initiated its investigative review of the controversy. Most critically, it explicitly noted that one specific working vendor had been forced to formally indicate to the Congresswoman's administrative office that they would be left with no alternative but to file an official legal complaint if their owed payment was not immediately forthcoming. Prompted by this revelation, he picked up his mobile device and called his trusted chief of staff at exactly 9:30 in the evening. "Could you kindly tell me exactly how much capital her re-election campaign managed to raise during the first financial quarter of this current year?" he inquired. "Approximately $9.6 million. His chief of staff replied promptly. "Why do you ask?" Johnson remained deeply quiet for a profound moment. She possessed $9.6 million resting securely within her campaign treasury, he articulated, very slowly, letting the gravity of the numbers hang in the air. And yet, a working-class vendor was literally forced to threaten her with a painful lawsuit, simply to secure the basic payment they were owed for their labor. His deeply experienced chief of staff understood instantaneously exactly what that profound observation meant as a devastating political question, while also simultaneously understanding exactly what it did not mean in a strictly legal sense. She did eventually pay them the money, the chief of staff quickly clarified, and the ethics committee officially closed the entire matter. "I am fully aware of that fact," Johnson replied softly. "I am absolutely not preparing to construct a legal argument here." "Then, what exact type of argument are you preparing to construct?" the chief of staff asked cautiously. Johnson looked down thoughtfully at the closed folder on his desk. She delivered a highly publicized speech. "Just last month," he stated evenly, "I took the time to watch the footage." She delivered it in Berlin while attending the prestigious Munich Security Conference. "Yes, she did," the Chief of Staff confirmed. "And I deliberately wrote down this specific quote." Johnson continued. She passionately declared to the audience, "I traveled here today because working-class citizens fundamentally deserve to be prominently represented upon the global world stage." She confidently stated that phrase while standing inside the Technical University of Berlin simultaneously, while she was comfortably residing at an opulent hotel that charges roughly $450 per single night. A heavy pause descended upon the phone line. She stood there and told those sophisticated people in Germany that she deeply, intimately understands exactly what the daily lives of struggling working people actually feel like. And yet, during the exact same week, she was in Europe making those soaring claims. She had $9.6 million sitting untouched in her campaign account. And merely 8 months prior to that moment, an everyday working seamstress was forced to threaten legal action against her just to get paid for making a dress. He calmly closed the folder. "I am simply going to politely ask her to explain how those two realities coexist." His chief of staff pondered the tactical scenario for a moment. She will expertly pivot and claim that it was merely an administrative error, handled entirely by her junior staff. She will forcefully assert that she possessed no personal knowledge of the delays. She will repeatedly remind the room that the Bipartisan Ethics Committee officially closed the matter. "That is highly probable," Johnson agreed. "Following all of those deflections, I will simply ask her to explain the presence of the $9.6 million once again." Back in the bright reality of the committee room, Johnson broke the silence. "Representative Ocasio-Cortez, I would very much like to begin our dialogue by revisiting a specific sentiment you so eloquently expressed during your opening statement. Today," Johnson stated politely, directing his gaze downward toward the yellow legal notepad resting before him. He had deliberately written only one single sentence across the entire page. "You passionately declared, 'The good people of my district sent me to Washington to forcefully hold power accountable, including when that process is uncomfortable, including when it is inconvenient, and absolutely including when it is me.'" He gently placed the yellow notepad back onto the desk. "I genuinely appreciate that sentiment. I truly wish to take you entirely at your word on that promise. Therefore, I would like to respectfully ask you a few questions regarding the official House Ethics Committee report that was formally released to the public on July 25th of this past year." He carefully extracted the stapled document from the protective confines of his folder and placed it squarely in the center of the wooden table. 26 pages. Entirely bipartisan. Exactly 5 Republican members and 5 Democratic members had affixed their signatures to its final conclusions. This investigative committee officially determined that you violated the established House gift rules in direct connection with your highly publicized attendance at the 2021 Met Gala event. To be entirely fair to you, the official finding did not conclude that you engaged in any form of malicious, intentional wrongdoing. The committee was very careful to specifically note that important distinction. However, the final finding did unequivocally conclude that you improperly accepted lavish gifts vastly in excess of what is legally permitted under our established House rules. Specifically, a gorgeous custom designer, gown expensive, accompanying accessories, professional hair and makeup services, and an exclusive entry ticket provided for your personal partner. The true fair market value of the luxury goods and premium services you graciously received totaled several thousands of dollars, significantly above what you actually paid out of pocket. He looked at her with a remarkably steady, unblinking gaze. I would like to focus our attention on a highly specific administrative detail neatly documented on page 14 of this report. The text clearly notes that several independent working vendors simply did not receive their rightful financial payment until well after the formal ethics investigation had already been initiated. Furthermore, it explicitly notes that at least one specific vendor was forced to inform your office that they would immediately file a formal legal complaint against you if their rightful payment was not forthcoming. He allowed a brief pause to command the room. During the very first financial quarter of the year 2025, your re-election campaign successfully raised an astonishing $9.6 million. He allowed another profoundly deliberate, completely untheatrical pause stretch across the silent chamber. A hardworking vendor who actively provided professional services for your glamorous Met Gala appearance was pushed to the absolute brink of having to threaten legal action against you before they were finally compensated for their labor. At that exact moment in time, you possessed $9.6 million, resting securely in your political campaign account. He looked at her with absolute calm. Can you please help me to intellectually understand that stark contradiction? Representative Ocasio-Cortez maintained the fiercely composed, polished facial expression of a seasoned politician who had thoroughly anticipated this exact line of aggressive questioning and had spent hours meticulously preparing her. Defensive posture. Speaker Johnson, I must remind you that the Bipartisan Ethics Committee reviewed this entire matter comprehensively and exhaustively over a period spanning nearly 4 full years. The committee ultimately concluded that my administrative staff exclusively handled all direct vendor communications and that I was absolutely not personally involved in the mundane daily mechanics of the payment process. The committee also correctly found that my administrative violations were entirely unintentional and certainly not willful acts of defiance. The legal matter has been fully and permanently resolved, and I completely respect and understand the committee's final findings. Johnson's voice remained incredibly soft. With all due respect, precise question was entirely different. I am actively trying to provide you with a comprehensive answer, she countered smoothly. Your campaign possessed $9.6 million in cash, Johnson repeated softly. A working vendor was forced to threaten you with a lawsuit just to get paid. I am simply asking you to explain how those two entirely disparate realities can possibly coexist. She took a deep, visibly measured breath to steady her rhythm. It is important to understand that my campaign treasury and my own personal household finances operate as two completely separate, distinct legal entities. The financial payments directly related to the Met Gala event were categorized as personal expenses absolutely, not campaign expenditures. Were you personally aware at the time that a working vendor had felt compelled to threaten the filing of a legal complaint? A brief, heavy pause followed. I eventually became broadly aware of various complicated vendor-on situations as they unfolded. Were you personally aware that one highly specific vendor had threatened to initiate legal action before finally receiving their rightful payment? I genuinely do not recall the precise, granular details of the official Ethics Committee report clearly documents this specific fact. On page 14, Johnson interrupted gently. Did you take the time to read? Page 14. I comprehensively reviewed the entirety of the final report, but did you specifically read page 14? Her jaw set itself with a very slight, almost imperceptible tension. I am fully aware of exactly what the official report contains. Then, you logically must know that a working vendor was forced to threaten legal action against you, and simultaneously you had access to $9.6 million. He carefully rested both of his hands flat against the polished surface of the table. His vocal tone had not shifted or elevated a single decibel. It remained the exact same quiet, unhurried, distinctly Southern cadence that it had been since he uttered his very first syllable, entirely devoid of malice, entirely without sharp edges. I want to be clear that I am absolutely not inquiring about complex legal standards or campaign finance loopholes. Representative Johnson continued smoothly. I am sincerely asking about something infinitely simpler and vastly more human than that. You were absolutely not a struggling individual, devoid of vast financial resources. You possessed $9.6 million, comfortably resting within a political campaign account, and simultaneously an everyday working person, a dedicated widowed seamstress, a hard-working stylist, an ordinary citizen who simply provided professional services and reasonably expected to be fairly compensated for their labor, was pushed to the humiliating point of having to threaten to legally sue you before they finally received the money they had rightfully earned. You passionately stated in your opening remarks just moments ago that you intimately understand exactly what it feels like to nervously check your bank account before buying groceries, and that you intimately understand what it means to lie awake at night, worrying about making the monthly rent. He fixed his eyes deeply upon hers. Do you honestly believe that hard-working seamstress had to nervously check her bank account that month? Do you honestly believe she had to lie awake, worrying about whether or not your enormously wealthy campaign apparatus was ever actually going to pay her? The atmospheric pressure inside the grand chamber had fundamentally altered. It had not changed in a loud or dramatic fashion. Absolutely no one had shouted in anger, and absolutely nothing physical had been violently thrown across the room. The polite procedural surface tension of the formal hearing remained impeccably intact, but something deeply foundational underneath the floorboards had unmistakably shifted, and every single soul present in the room acutely felt the sudden change in gravity. Every single vendor was ultimately paid in full. Representative Ocasio-Cortez stated firmly, every single vendor received their money. Yes, they were finally paid only after the formal ethics investigation had officially commenced, and only after the desperate threat of legal action had been levied against you, Johnson noted, quietly. The administrative timeline of those payments was exclusively managed by my junior staff members. She insisted, you possessed $9.6 million. Johnson reiterated one final time, his voice barely rising above a whisper. I simply want to ensure that the historical record is perfectly clear on that specific fact. He slowly reached his hand forward to retrieve the second document, nestled within his folder. I would now like to pivot our discussion and talk about your recent trip to Munich. He carefully placed a single, crisp printed page down onto 20% all dollars eyes, the table, without offering any dramatic introductory remarks. This is an official transcript. It is dated February 16, 2026, recorded at the Technical University of Berlin. In direct connection with your attendance at the prestigious Munich Security Conference, you willingly participated in a high-profile panel discussion focused heavily on American foreign policy strategy. During this panel, you offered extensive remarks, deeply criticizing the current administration's diplomatic approach regarding the nation of Venezuela. He smoothly located the relevant highlighted passage on the printed transcript. You confidently stated to the audience, and I am quoting your exact words directly here, that absolutely does not mean that we possess the right to simply kidnap a sovereign head of state and gleefully engage in reckless acts of war simply because the nation in question happens to be located below the equator. He looked up from the page and met her gaze. Representative, the nation of Venezuela is geographically located entirely within the Northern Hemisphere. It permanently sits between approximately 2 degrees north and 12 degrees north latitude. Its absolute southernmost geographical point rests more than 100 miles entirely north of the actual equator. He softly set the printed transcript back down onto the desk. You proudly hold a formal university degree, specifically in the complex field of international relations, earned from Boston University. The nation of Venezuela was the highly specific subject you were actively voluntarily discussing on that stage. Yet, you confidently made this glaringly inaccurate geographic claim not just once, but twice. The second time, according to the official transcript, you delivered the statement even more emphatically than the first. He allowed a brief pause to let the reality settle. Now, I am absolutely not asking you about this minor incident simply because I believe basic geography is the central point of importance. Here I am asking you about this because of the underlying reason regarding precisely why you were sitting on that stage in Munich to begin with. He looked at her directly, completely devoid of political malice. You were attending the Munich Security Conference specifically because you are actively contemplating launching a political campaign for higher national office. Multiple respected journalistic outlets widely reported that your highly NB's publicized appearance in Europe was deliberately intended to publicly demonstrate your foreign policy credibility. It was meant to definitively prove to the establishment that a grassroots representative hailing from the Bronx could comfortably and intellectually operate on the most complex global world stage. Your political campaign successfully raised over $20 million in the year 2025 alone. You clearly possess the vast financial resources to meticulously prepare for absolutely any public appearance you ever choose to make. And yet you confidently arrived at one of the most intellectually prestigious foreign policy forums on the entire planet. And you were fundamentally factually incorrect on 2 separate occasions regarding the basic geographic location of the very country you were actively attempting to discuss. He neatly folded the transcript in half. I simply want to ask you a very direct question. Before you eagerly boarded that flight to Munich, exactly how much time did you actually spend preparing for that complex discussion regarding Venezuela? She possessed a highly polished, fiercely practiced answer, completely ready for deployment. That minor geographical error was simply an inadvertent, momentary slip of the tongue, and it has already been, you confidently stated it. Twice, Johnson interjected gently. I briefly misspoke while navigating the flow of the same lengthy answer about the country I was actively discussing. Senator, any seasoned politician. I am a congressman representative, not a senator. Johnson corrected, his voice remaining exactly the same, calm, unbothered temperature. But I graciously accept the reality of the human error. A profound beat of absolute silence echoed throughout the massive chamber. Several astute political observers seated high up in the press gallery instantly understood exactly what a masterful rhetorical maneuver had just flawlessly transpired. Johnson had completely absorbed her defensive mistake without emphasizing it, without resorting to petty mockery, and without desperately trying to weaponize it against her. He had simply quietly noted the glaring error for the permanent record and smoothly moved past it. It was vastly more psychologically disarming than any aggressive partisan attack he could possibly have launched. Please allow me the opportunity to provide you with the complete contextual picture here. Johnson seamlessly continued. You grandly arrived in Munich, accompanied by significant advance preparation and an enormous amount of media fanfare. Your public relations office excitedly announced the international trip a full 2 weeks in advance. Multiple news outlets eagerly reported it as a highly deliberate, calculated effort to dramatically expand your foreign policy profile, a strategic move designed to emphatically show the world that you were finally ready to command a much larger political stage, perhaps a national stage, or perhaps even a presidential stage. The official trip announcement was heavily accompanied by a flurry of talking points, centering heavily on the noble concepts of working-class internationalism and global economic justice. He looked at her with unwavering steadiness. The Munich Security Conference is universally recognized as one of the most incredibly prestigious gatherings of elite foreign policy minds in the entire world. Powerful heads of state routinely attend. Former legendary secretaries of state attend. Brilliant scholars who have dedicated their entire adult lives to meticulously studying these incredibly complex geopolitical issues attend. You were physically present there for 2 full days, and you were graciously granted a highly significant amount of premier platform time. The explicitly stated, the core purpose of your highly publicized presence was to decisively demonstrate to the world that you possessed the deep intellectual depth and rigorous preparation required to operate seamlessly at that elevated level. And yet you stood in front of that elite room and confidently told them that the nation of Venezuela is located below the equator. He paused for a fraction of a second. Then, when a journalist specifically asked you whether or not the United States military should commit ground troops to actively defend Taiwan if the nation of China decides to invade, a profound question that has arguably been the absolute central foreign policy dilemma in the Pacific theater for the past 20 years. A question that any truly serious candidate seeking high national office would absolutely need to be prepared to answer with clarity. You provided a rambling response that a prominent CNN news anchor later compared on live national television to the confused rambling of a frightened Miss Teen USA pageant contestant. That characterization is wildly unfair. She forcefully began, her voice tightening. I assure you, I watched the video clip. Johnson calmly replied, I watched it multiple times. I want you to know that I deliberately watched it multiple times, specifically because I desperately wanted to make absolutely sure that I was being completely fair to you in my assessment. Your answer regarding the Taiwan dilemma was absolutely not unfair to, quote, it was genuinely incredibly difficult to logically follow. She stared intensely at him, her face completely frozen into the complex expression of a fiercely proud individual who has just been gently told something undeniably true in a tone of voice that she completely lacks the ability. Effectively challenge, I would like to respectfully ask about another specific detail directly connected to your time in Munich. He continued softly. Exactly what hotel did you choose to stay in during your visit? She blinked, momentarily, thrown off balance. I genuinely fail to see how my lodging accommodations are relevant. 2. The historic Kessler Grand Hotel, located in central Munich. Johnson stated, reading from memory, the standard nightly rates at that specific establishment during the peak period of the security conference routinely ran somewhere between $450 and $800 per single night. He was absolutely not looking down at his printed papers anymore. He was looking directly, intently at her. Resided in that luxurious environment for 3 consecutive nights, confidently speaking to the world about the desperate necessity of working-class politics, speaking passionately about the destructive evils of runaway global inequality, and passionately preaching about the desperate need for political leaders who actually understand the brutal daily realities of ordinary people's lives. I was actively representing my constituents upon an international stage. She fired back. Hard-working constituents residing within your 14th district in New York currently possess a median household income of approximately $37,000 per year. Johnson recited calmly. Many of those good people, forced to work multiple grueling jobs just to survive. Many of them lie awake, terrified, deeply worried about how they will afford rent in a rapidly gentrifying city, where the average cost of a basic apartment drastically exceeds their entire annual salary. Absolutely no, that she replied fiercely. And, for the very first time, during the entire morning, there was a raw, unfiltered emotion suddenly vibrating within her voice that was absolutely not rehearsed. Composure, it was something vastly closer to pure, genuine conviction, the unmistakable, authentic article of a human being who truly, deeply believes in the righteousness of what they are saying. That exact reality is precisely why I traveled there. To fiercely speak for them, standing proudly upon a global stage where they would tragically never ever be invited themselves. While comfortably residing at a $450 a night luxury hotel, Johnson noted quietly and exactly who graciously paid for those expensive travel arrangements. A tense pause settled over the room. Standard congressional travel expenses are strictly funded by your constituents, the hard-working taxpayers of the 14th District, including those exact same people, making barely $37,000 a year. Absolutely all sitting members of the United States Congress routinely travel on official government business. She pointed out defensively. I completely know that, Johnson replied softly. I am absolutely not attempting to construct a legal argument here. I am trying to ask you a fundamentally different kind of philosophical question. He paused, allowing the silence to stretch. And for the very first time, he slowly reached out and picked up a second separate printed document from his desk. A single piece of paper, which he deliberately placed upon the table, without offering any verbal introduction whatsoever. I would like to take a moment to ask you about the Green New Deal. She had been mentally bracing herself for this specific inevitable pivot for years. Absolutely every single Republican opponent she had ever debated eventually maneuvered their way toward attacking the Green New Deal. She had fiercely answered 1,000 variations of this exact inquiry. She possessed her sharpest, most thoroughly rehearsed defensive answers, locked and fully ready to deploy. The sweeping environmental resolution that you originally introduced in the year 2019 boldly called for a massive, nationwide commitment to achieving net zero greenhouse gas emissions. The text addressed the massive carbon footprint of commercial air travel quite extensively. Specifically, it highlighted the devastating atmospheric emissions generated by the commercial aviation industry. The official frequently asked questions document that your own legislative office proudly published alongside the resolution enthusiastically discussed the ambitious possibility of aggressively building out high-speed rail networks across the country. Networks so incredibly extensive and efficient that commercial air travel would essentially become using your own office's exact framing entirely unnecessary for routine domestic trips. That specific frequently asked questions document was subsequently withdrawn from circulation and has been wildly mischaracterized by bad faith actors for years, she quickly countered. I am fully aware that the document was eventually withdrawn, Johnson replied evenly. I am simply asking you about the core, underlying principles residing deeply behind the text. The fundamental principle that routine commercial air travel, explicitly because of its massive carbon emissions footprint, absolutely must be reduced significantly as a vital part of any truly serious global climate response. That exact same guiding principle was prominently featured within the revised resolution, when you proudly reintroduced a modified version of the Green New Deal in the year 2023. The specific framing regarding aviation was slightly adjusted for optics, but the core, underlying concern regarding severe atmospheric emissions remained entirely intact. You have spoken about this existential crisis quite extensively. Yes, I have, she stated proudly. I deeply believe that drastically reducing global aviation emissions is absolutely essential to human survival. During the very first financial quarter of the year 2019, Johnson smoothly interjected, looking directly down at the specific document. Resting in front of him, your political campaign managed to spend $29,000 exclusively on commercial air travel over the incredibly brief span of merely 3 months. This stark financial reality was widely reported by the Washington Post. She had aggressively answered this specific attack numerous times. Before sitting members of Congress are heavily required to travel constantly in order to conduct official government business. The complex logistical nature of actively representing the people of New York while working in Washington fundamentally requires $29,000 spent in a single quarter strictly on air travel. Johnson repeated softly, effectively cutting through her rehearsed defense, all while you were simultaneously passionately advocating for the passage of sweeping legislation, whose entire foundational premise was built upon the idea that routine air travel contributes massively to the existential climate crisis that you yourself were frantically trying to solve. I am a human being who also occasionally flies on airplanes, and I also utilize modern air conditioning, she shot back defiantly. I have openly stated that undeniable fact publicly on numerous occasions. I am absolutely not demanding that everyday individuals be forced to make crushing, personal sacrifices that the federal government hasn't even bothered to build the necessary infrastructure to support. Yet, the core philosophy of the Green New Deal is entirely about forcing systemic institutional change. Absolutely not about policing minor, individual choices. I completely understand the intellectual contours of that argument, Johnson replied gently. I have heard it articulated many times. It is a completely logically coherent political argument, and I assure you, I have absolutely no desire to sit here and tediously relitigate the nuances of climate policy with you today. He looked at her with a profound, quiet intensity. I am absolutely not asking you about the technical details of your policy. I am asking you about the authenticity of your brand. He allowed that specific, heavily loaded word to land softly in the center of the silent room. Once again, it was the exact same conceptual word he had utilized moments before. You forcefully introduced sweeping legislation deeply, premised upon the foundational idea that the exact way deeply wealthy people choose to live their lives. The endless private flying, the grotesque overconsumption, the massive carbon footprint, generated purely for the sake of personal comfort, constitutes a profound moral failing that urgently requires immediate, systemic, legislative correction. You passionately stood before cameras and declared that this issue was an existential emergency. You declared that it was a literal crisis. You forcefully stated that wealthy people sitting in positions of immense power were deliberately making selfish choices that were literally destroying the entire planet. And yet, simultaneously, your own political campaign was comfortably spending $29,000 on commercial flights in a mere 3 months, all while you were enthusiastically introducing that exact legislation. The structural systems, she began to argue. I am already intimately familiar with the philosophical argument regarding structural systems, Johnson repeated gently. I literally just stated that I have heard it before. What I am actively trying to ask you today is infinitely simpler and vastly more human than any of that. He looked deeply at her completely, without any trace of partisan hostility, entirely without any smug sense of political triumph, projecting only the incredibly patient, hyper-focused attention of a deeply serious man who had meticulously done his homework, absolutely did not feel the childish need to theatrically perform anything for the rolling cameras. I am simply asking whether or not the hardworking people you claim to represent, the exhausted people struggling to survive on $37,000 a year, the prosen by dozen people who simply cannot afford to fly, the people who ride the crowded subway trains every morning, the people who must desperately budget their weekly grocery trips down to the final penny, whether or not those specific people can. Look closely at the luxurious way you currently live your life, and then listen closely to the passionate things you routinely say, and still genuinely see the exact same person. He softly set the printed document down onto the wooden desk. Or, alternatively, whether there is a massive growing philosophical distance between exactly what you publicly say and exactly what you privately do, a profound echoing distance that has slowly gotten significantly wider over the course of the last 8 years, entirely without you ever even noticing it happening. He leaned forward toward the microphone, just the absolute smallest, discernible amount. His vocal tone dropped slightly in register, absolutely not in sudden anger, but rather adopting the highly specific, deeply observant quality of a quiet man. Hailing from the complex social dynamics of Louisiana, a man who has spent his entire adult life sitting in heavily negotiated rooms where powerful people routinely say one thing, while secretly meaning another, and who has thoroughly learned that the quiet, unsaid gap existing between those two competing realities is exactly where the absolute truth actually lives. Representative Ocasio-Cortez, I sincerely want to ask you a question regarding your personal brand. The loaded word landed quietly, heavily upon the polished wood. She heard it echo clearly in her mind. Not a question regarding her voting record, not a question regarding her specific policy, positions. A question regarding her fundamental brand. He looked at her with unwavering, piercing steadiness. You have brilliantly built your entire modern political career upon the foundation of a highly specific, incredibly compelling personal narrative, the inspiring story of a humble bartender hailing from the working-class streets of the Bronx, the deeply moving story of someone who grew up entirely without access to generational wealth, who intimately understood drawing, purely from brutal personal experience, exactly what it truly means to struggle just to survive. The story of a fiercely intelligent young woman who triumphantly arrived in the halls of Congress. Absolutely not, because she possessed elite family connections or massive institutional financial backing, but entirely because the working-class people residing within her vibrant district recognized something undeniably true, shining within her. They proudly recognized a reflection of themselves. That specific narrative is incredibly powerful, and crucially, it is in very significant part entirely true. I am absolutely not sitting here today attempting to dispute the factual reality of your humble background. I am absolutely not attempting to dispute the undeniable fact that your loving family sacrificed immensely for your success. I am absolutely not disputing the fact that you originally arrived in Washington possessing a highly problem-sentient sire's unique, vital perspective that the vast majority of deeply privileged individuals wandering through this massive building simply do not possess. He paused, letting the silence hang heavy. But I truly want to ask you, face to face, about the immense echoing distance that now exists between who you were then and who you are right now. The grand chamber suddenly possessed the terrifying, suffocating quality of absolute stillness that immediately precedes a massive tectonic event. The seasoned journalists packed tightly into the press gallery were sitting completely motionless. The supportive Democratic committee members arrayed around the dais had entirely ceased. Their rhythmic nodding, Representative Ocasio-Cortez sat rigidly upright, her hands tightly folded together, her facial expression masterfully controlled in the siege's highly specific, disciplined manner of a seasoned warrior who inherently knows that the next 60 seconds of her life will demand absolutely every single ounce of intellectual fortitude she possesses. Johnson looked down thoughtfully at the thick Ethics Committee report, then shifted his gaze toward the printed Munich transcript. Then, with quiet deliberation, he smoothly pushed both documents entirely to the far side of the wooden table. Physically removing the paper barrier between them, looked directly into her eyes. With absolutely nothing obscuring his view, you currently possess $9.6 million, resting comfortably in your political campaign account. A hard-working everyday seamstress was pushed to the absolute brink of having to threaten to legally sue you just to receive the basic payment she earned for her labor. You comfortably resided in a luxurious $450 a night hotel room across the ocean, simply to deliver a speech about the 2S, vital importance of working-class politics. You confidently sat on a global stage and confidently told the entire world that the nation of Venezuela was located below the equator, despite proudly holding a prestigious university degree, specifically in international relations. Now, none of those isolated incidents, when viewed individually, fundamentally defines exactly who you are as a human being. I completely understand and accept that reality. But here is exactly what I truly want to ask you. Today, he firmly placed both of his bare hands flat against the polished surface of the table. The hard-working people residing in your home district. The exhausted people desperately trying to survive on $37,000 a year. The anxious people nervously checking their dwindling bank accounts before daring to purchase basic groceries. The exact same beautiful people you so passionately described in your opening statement earlier this morning as being the singular driving reason you originally chose to run for office. If those specific individuals were forced to look at those four undeniable realities placed together, exactly, what do you honestly think they would think? He looked directly at her, absolutely without blinking. Would they genuinely still see a reflection of themselves shining within you? Or would they simply see someone who used to be exactly like them, but who has slowly, inevitably transformed into something else entirely? The grand room was completely overwhelmingly still. It was the exact profound, devastating question that countless lengthy magazine profiles had nervously circled for 8 long years without ever possessing the courage to land. It was the quiet, terrifying question that her most devoted. Grassroots supporters occasionally asked each other in hushed whispers late at night before quickly burying the thought away. It was the exact same weaponized question that her fiercest Republican opponents had desperately attempted to ask 100 different times, utilizing 100 different clumsy formats, and had invariably gotten completely wrong purely because they had always chosen to ask it as a vicious partisan attack, as a cynical accusation, as a blunt political weapon. And she had consistently, masterfully possessed the unique ability to effortlessly deflect any blunt attack, to gracefully absorb any cynical accusation, and to brilliantly disarm any poorly wielded weapon. But, crucially, Speaker Johnson had absolutely not asked the question as a partisan attack. He had asked it as a genuine, profoundly sincere, incredibly patient, devastatingly direct philosophical question delivered by a quiet man hailing from Louisiana, who had done absolutely nothing over the course of the preceding 30 minutes, except politely ask her to explain the details of her own documented record, utilizing her own spoken words. And the question had finally squarely landed. She bravely opened her mouth to respond. This is exactly the predictable, cynical kind of toxic politics that the entrenched political establishment routinely utilizes to silence powerful, progressive voices. Whenever a strong working-class woman actually dares to speak up, whenever she bravely dares to hold entrenched corporate power accountable, whenever she fiercely dares to represent marginalized communities that have historically never possessed a seat at the table, suddenly, absolutely everything she does is unfairly scrutinized. Every minor human mistake is wildly amplified. Every single. With all due respect, I absolutely did not ask you a question regarding your constituents. Johnson gently interrupted. And I certainly did not ask you a question regarding the broad philosophy of progressive politics. She abruptly stopped speaking. I simply asked you whether or not the hard-working people of your home district, the exact same people you so beautifully described in your own opening statement, would genuinely still see a reflection of themselves within you. I have proudly spent my entire professional career fiercely fighting for those exact people, she declared passionately. That is, absolutely not. What I just asked you, Johnson replied softly. The quiet sentence fell into the dead silence of the room. In the exact same manner, a heavy stone falls smoothly into a dark pool of water. I did not ask you whether or not you bravely fight for them. I asked you whether or not they still genuinely see a reflection of themselves within you. He looked at her with profound sadness. Those are two fundamentally entirely different questions. Representative, the act of fiercely fighting for someone and the reality of genuinely being one of them are two entirely different concepts. You brilliantly built your entire career upon the compelling narrative of being one of them. I am simply asking you today whether or not you actually still are. She stared back at him. She was universally recognized as being incredibly gifted. At fiercely staring down powerful opponents, she had fearlessly faced down intimidating cabinet secretaries, ruthless billionaires, and even the president of the United States. She had looked directly at all of those powerful men, and had always managed to discover exactly the right devastating thing to say. She frantically searched her mind to discover exactly the right thing to say. Right now, I am incredibly, Proud of exactly where I came from. She stated firmly, I am fiercely proud of my beautiful community, and I absolutely will not allow cynical Republican attacks levied against my personal background to distract the public from the incredibly vital, very real work of I have absolutely not launched a single attack against your background. Johnson clarified softly, I have merely politely asked you to explain your own recent professional choices holding this deeply broken institution, fully accountable for the tragic ways it has systematically failed working people. She pushed forward, her voice rising in volume, which is exactly what this important oversight hearing is fundamentally supposed to be focused on, which is exactly what this vital piece of ethics legislation is, specifically designed to finally address, which is precisely why I am sitting here today. You are sitting here today, Johnson replied with absolute unshakable quietness, specifically because you were formally asked to provide testimony regarding congressional ethics reform, and I have simply asked you to provide clarity regarding your own personal ethics, finding your own astronomical travel expenses, your own public geography, error, and your own evolving relationship with the exact people you claim to represent. He looked directly at her, one final devastating time, and instead of choosing to honestly answer those specific questions, you simply chose to loudly tell me about how hard you fight. He slowly picked up his fine ink pen, gently set it back down, and looked softly at the closed manila folder. The act of fighting for vulnerable people and the reality of genuinely being one of them are two fundamentally different things. You intimately know that undeniable truth. Absolutely everyone sitting in this quiet room intimately knows that truth. And I sincerely believe, I truly think that somewhere along the chaotic journey of the last 8 years, you simply stopped being one of them, and you slowly transitioned into becoming someone who merely fights for them from a safe distance. And I want to be clear, that is absolutely not nothing. That is a real thing. That advocacy work is genuinely real. He paused, letting the finality of the moment wash over the chamber. But you brilliantly built your entire political identity upon the premise of the first thing. And the reality of the first thing is exactly what I have been quietly asking you about. Today, he allowed one final profound pause to stretch. I have absolutely no further questions for this specific witness. She methodically gathered her loose printed materials with the practiced, hyper-efficient movements of an individual who possessed decades of experience operating within the public eye. She gathered them, maintaining a fiercely composed facial expression that masterfully refused to betray absolutely anything regarding the emotional turbulence churning underneath the surface. She politely accepted a brief supportive whisper from a sympathetic Democratic colleague seated directly to her left. She offered a tight nod of acknowledgement. She confidently stood up from the wooden chair. She absolutely did not look in the direction of Speaker Johnson. As she purposefully walked out of the massive double doors, out in the marble hallway, her frantic campaign manager was already actively barking orders into a cell phone. By the precise moment she reached the quiet sanctuary of the private elevator, her brilliant communications team had already frantically drafted the very first aggressive version of a massive nationwide fundraising email. The provocative subject line read, "Powerful Republicans are absolutely terrified of me. Please chip in $5 today to help me fight back." That perfectly optimized email successfully raised an astonishing $2.1 million over the course of the subsequent 24 hours. The heavily edited video clip, featuring her defiant answer, I have proudly spent my entire professional career fiercely fighting for those exact people, skillfully juxtaposed with Johnson's quiet, devastating response. That is absolutely not what I just asked. You had already been viewed a staggering 14 million times across various social media platforms by the exact moment the lucrative fundraising email officially launched. $2.1 million raised. 14 million views generated. Her dedicated internal team enthusiastically pointed toward the massive influx of financial capital as absolute undeniable proof that she had definitively won the chaotic news cycle. They deliberately chose not to point toward the 14 million views, however, primarily because they inherently understood that a highly significant portion of those 14 million individuals watching the exchange were absolutely not her bitter political opponents. Many of them were actually her most devoted, loyal supporters. And tragically, her loyal supporters were suddenly beginning to ask highly specific, profoundly uncomfortable questions that generic political fundraising emails simply do not possess the capacity to answer. A passionate young woman named Jasmine Rivera had enthusiastically volunteered countless hours of her life to fiercely support Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez's re-election campaign. Back in the year 2022, Jasmine was currently 24 years of age. She was proudly born and raised in the vibrant neighborhoods of the South Bronx, the resilient daughter of an exhausted home health aide and an overworked delivery truck driver. She had spent her entire childhood growing up inside a decaying apartment building where the sole elevator completely broke down, at least once every single month, and where the absentee landlord routinely took 3 full weeks to bother fixing it. She had diligently attended a chronically underfunded public high school, where the cramped science laboratory possessed outdated equipment originally purchased in the 1990s, and where a single overwhelmed guidance counselor was tasked with handling the complex emotional needs of 400 desperate students all by herself. Jasmine had enthusiastically knocked on hundreds of apartment doors for Ocasio-Cortez during the crisp autumn of 2022, specifically because she had believed genuinely, deeply, completely without any trace of cynical reservation in the exact, beautiful way that you only truly believe things when you are 22 years old, and you finally discover someone who miraculously seems to have emerged from the exact same struggling place that you emerged from. That, here finally, was a powerful person who truly understood. A person who had physically stood inside that exact same broken elevator. A person who had sat inside that exact same underfunded school. A person who had survived on the exact same cheap dollar menu lunches, who had ridden the exact same incredibly crowded subway trains, and who intimately understood, drawing entirely from the inside of her bones, exactly what the harsh reality of her specific neighborhood genuinely felt like. She sat quietly and watched the viral video clip on her cracked mobile phone during the quiet evening hours. Following the dramatic committee hearing, she methodically watched it twice over. Then, she slowly opened her TikTok application and began recording a raw, unfiltered video. I still completely support AOC. Jasmine began softly sitting cross-legged upon her small bed, the window completely open behind her, letting in the faint sounds of the busy street below. I really need people to thoroughly understand that I am absolutely not coming at her with this. I am definitely not trying to start any kind of toxic drama online. She paused for a heavy moment, looking directly into the small camera lens with the profound, direct honesty exclusive to someone who has not yet learned the protective adult habit of looking away from deeply uncomfortable truths. But that man sitting up there asked her a very real, incredibly profound question. He simply asked whether or not the ordinary people living in our district, my home district, the place where I literally grew, up exactly 4 blocks away from her local office, whether or not we genuinely still see a reflection of ourselves inside of her. And her only answer was to boldly declare that she has been fiercely fighting for us. Jasmine shook her head very slightly, her expression radiating profound disappointment. Fighting for us is absolutely not the exact same thing as genuinely being one of us. She intimately knows that undeniable fact. That is literally the entire foundational point of absolutely everything she always publicly says. The core idea that we desperately need elected people who intimately understand our complicated lives, precisely because they have physically lived them, not simply because they have studied them in a textbook or because they occasionally feel guilty about them. That is literally her entire political brand. And that quiet man politely asked her if she is genuinely still that exact same person. She just angrily told him that she's been fighting. Jasmine stared deeply into the camera lens for a long, silent moment without uttering a single word. That is absolutely not the same answer. I desperately need her to honestly answer the actual question, not because powerful Republicans are terrified of her. I genuinely do not care about any of that political theater. I need her to answer it because I proudly voted for her specifically because she was one of us. And I desperately need to know in my heart if she actually still is. Jasmine, quietly, posted the unedited video to the platform. She turned off her lamp and went to sleep. When she finally woke up the following morning, the raw emotional video had miraculously accumulated 8.3 million views. A quiet, hard-working man named Carlos Mendoza had proudly cast his ballot for Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez in 4 consecutive elections. He was currently 44 years of age, a highly skilled electrician, employed by a large commercial contracting company operating throughout the Bronx. He earned exactly $52,000 every single year, a modest financial figure which, operating within the brutal economic reality of New York City in the year 2026, meant that he was forced to meticulously calculate every single month exactly what vital necessities he could possibly afford and exactly what he absolutely could not. He was the fiercely proud father of a 19-year-old son who desperately wanted to attend a 4-year university and a brilliant 16-year-old daughter who was already proactively asking detailed questions regarding local vocational trade programs, entirely because she had quietly done the brutal financial math herself and intimately understood that the resulting numbers were absolutely not generous. Carlos was absolutely not a highly political person, at least not in the performative, toxic way that wealthy people shouting on cable television are highly political. He absolutely did not watch those partisan cable news programs. He entirely ignored the chaotic, toxic world of political social media. He simply voted every cycle because his beloved late mother had firmly taught him that voting was the absolute bare minimum requirement of existing in a society, that you possessed the right to complain, or you possessed the right to vote, but you absolutely did not possess the right to loudly complain without actively voting. He took that solemn responsibility incredibly seriously. He enthusiastically voted for Ocasio-Cortez, primarily because she hailed from the Bronx, not strictly because of her complex progressive policies, although he did agree with some of them, but fundamentally because she was a proud daughter of the Bronx. And that specific geographical reality meant something deeply profound, in a way that he simply did not need to articulate to anyone else who was also from the Bronx. His son quietly showed him the viral video clip shortly. After they had finished eating dinner, Carlos watched it, silently on his son's glowing phone, standing motionless in the center of their small kitchen. Still wearing his heavy, dusty work clothes, he watched the polite Johnson questions. He watched the defensive answer regarding fighting. He watched the quiet, devastating final exchange. His son carefully watched his father's face as he absorbed the interaction. "Exactly. What do you think about that?" his son finally asked, softly. Carlos, slowly, handed the glowing device back. He thought deeply about the bod, profound interaction for a long moment, pondering it in the exact, slow, deliberate way that he thought about all complex things at the absolute end of a grueling 12-hour workday. Very carefully, entirely without rushing specifically, because the brutal day had already demanded too much rushing, and the quiet evening hours did not require any further urgency. That quiet man sitting up there asked her a very real, very fair question. Carlos finally stated softly, "Yeah," his son agreed. He specifically asked if we genuinely still see ourselves in her. "What do you think, Dad? Do we?" Carlos slowly picked up his heavy canvas work bag from where he had carelessly dropped it down by the front door, and he quietly carried it into the cramped laundry room. He slowly walked back and stood thoughtfully in the kitchen doorway. "I honestly think she used to be somebody who was forced to nervously check her bank account before she dared to buy her groceries," he finally said, his voice laced with a quiet, undeniable melancholy, "exactly like we have to do every single week." His son waited patiently for him to finish the thought. "And now, I think she is simply somebody who forcefully fights for the specific people who are forced to check their bank accounts before buying groceries." He paused, looking down at his worn boots. "And that is simply not the exact same thing as actually being one of them anymore. Is that a bad thing?" Deeply about the philosophical implications. "It is absolutely not a bad thing," he concluded softly. "It is just fundamentally different. It is a completely different reality than exactly what she has always claimed to be." He quietly turned and walked down the short hallway to finally change out of his dusty work clothes. He absolutely did not make the cynical decision to stop voting entirely. He was fundamentally not the kind of weak person who simply gave up and stopped voting. But for the very first time since the hopeful autumn of 2018, he felt the incredibly small, highly specific, agonizing weight of a monad, profound question settling into his heart that he had simply never been forced to confront before. It was absolutely not a minor question regarding the technical details of her complex policies. It was absolutely not a skeptical question regarding her overall legislative effectiveness. Rather, it was a terrifying foundational question regarding the absolute truth of her core story. The beautiful, inspiring story he had deeply believed in, the compelling story he had enthusiastically voted for time and time again. The original story had absolutely not been a cynical lie. He deeply knew that reality in his bones. She had genuinely been a struggling bartender. Her family had genuinely fought to survive. That specific pain was undeniable and real. But stories he intimately understood possessed the tragic capacity to quietly stop being entirely true without ever officially becoming malicious lies. They can simply quietly, gradually transform into something else entirely. And you do not always possess the ability to notice the subtle transformation occurring until a quiet, polite stranger firmly asks you to look closely at the massive echoing distance, expanding between exactly where the beautiful story originally started and exactly where it finally ended up. During that exact same quiet evening, high up inside her luxurious apartment, located in the heart of Washington, D.C., Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez found herself entirely awake at 2 o'clock in the morning. She had officially given the aggressive fundraising email, her explicit professional, the blessing. She had personally witnessed the staggering $2.1 million figure successfully roll into the accounts. She had spoken at length to her enthusiastic campaign manager, who was immensely pleased with the financial windfall, and she had spoken to her aggressive communications director, who was equally thrilled, and she had graciously accepted phone calls from two supportive legislative colleagues who specifically reached out to assure her that they believed she had handled the Kamazan, hostile confrontation incredibly well. She sat alone in the dark, upon her expensive modern couch, the glowing screen of her laptop illuminating the shadows, and she deliberately watched the viral video clip. She did not watch it to obsessively check the climbing view count. She already intimately knew the staggering view count. 30 million total views, climbing exponentially higher with every passing hour. She actively chose to watch it, because she desperately needed to hear the exact cadence of his profound question once again, completely separated from the incredibly highly charged adrenaline-fueled atmosphere of the massive hearing room, completely separated from the immediate crushing political need to aggressively respond in real time. She watched the glowing screen as Johnson politely placed the printed documents onto the polished table. She watched herself forcefully deliver the rehearsed defensive answers regarding the unpaid dress, vendor regarding the embarrassing Munich incident regarding the glaring contradictions of the Green New Deal. She watched her digital avatar deliver the exact defensive answer she had ultimately chosen to give, the absolute best rhetorical answer she felt she could possibly construct in that terrifying moment, the sincere answer she genuinely believed in her heart, the passionate answer regarding fiercely fighting, regarding spending her entire professional career, fiercely fighting for those exact vulnerable people. She watched the digital avatar of Mike Johnson quietly reply, "That is absolutely not what I just asked you." She slowly closed the laptop screen, plunging the room into darkness. The massive, sprawling city glittering endlessly outside her expansive window was incredibly quiet. She had successfully lived and worked within the powerful confines of Washington for 8 long years. Her luxurious apartment currently cost exactly $3,200 every single month. She had heavily rationalized that exorbitant figure in her mind. At the exact moment she signed the binding lease, she had successfully justified the massive expense by pointing toward the undeniable reality of astronomically high Washington rental prices, by pointing toward the absolute professional necessity of living relatively close to the Capitol building, by pointing toward the stressful fact that she still carried significant personal student debt and was actively paying it down, and finally, by fiercely reminding herself that she was absolutely not the massive cynical hypocrite that her most vicious political enemies constantly insisted she was absolutely. All of those logical justifications were entirely, factually true. Yet, as she sat alone in the profound quiet of the darkness, she found herself slowly thinking about something she had actively refused to let herself deeply think about. For an incredibly long time, she thought deeply about the beautiful chaos of that very first impossible campaign, the miraculous campaign of 2018. The magical period when absolutely no one in the political establishment believed she possessed a chance of winning. The exhausting days when she was, personally, physically knocking on apartment doors in the suffocating, brutal heat of August, the humble era, when her entire campaign headquarters was merely a tiny, aggressively hot, borrowed space, located directly above a noisy neighborhood laundromat. The time when her primary district director had simply been an exhausted, passionate, unpaid volunteer who simultaneously worked a demanding second job just to survive. The beautiful moments when she had passionately delivered soaring speeches inside cramped, unair-conditioned community rooms located deep within Co-op City and Parkchester. She vividly remembered the specific magical way the ordinary people sitting in those cramped rooms had looked up at her, absolutely not looking at her as if she were a polished, distant, a politician, but looking at her as if she were something entirely different, something magical. They had looked at her as a person they intimately recognized, a person who had ridden the exact same broken train, the person who had desperately worried about the exact same terrifying things. She thought deeply about the incredibly specific, hopeful way those vulnerable people had looked at her back then. She thought deeply about Jasmine Rivera's raw emotional video, which she had quietly watched earlier, that afternoon, right before the aggressive fundraising email had officially launched. Over 8 million views, a 24-year-old girl hailing from the Bronx who had enthusiastically knocked on doors to support her, and who was now publicly painfully asking, in front of an audience of 31 million total strangers, whether or not she genuinely still was exactly who she had always proudly claimed to be. She had absolutely not officially responded to Jasmine Rivera's emotional video. Her highly paid, deeply experienced communications team had strongly advised against engaging with it. Engaging with the video would merely amplify the negative narrative they confidently assured her. The embarrassing clip would naturally cycle out of the chaotic news ecosystem within exactly 72 hours, in the exact same manner that absolutely all viral clips inevitably cycle out of the collective consciousness. Perhaps their cynical professional assessment was entirely correct. She sat, utterly motionless, in the suffocating quiet of her $3,200 a month luxury apartment, thinking deeply about the profound, devastating question that she had actively failed to answer. Inside the hearing room, the question that she had entirely ignored regarding Jasmine Rivera's video, and the profound, terrifying question that simply could not possibly be answered by launching another massive fundraising email. She genuinely did not know, sitting alone in the darkness at 2 o'clock in the morning, exactly what the honest answer to that question actually was. That realization was the absolute most terrifying part, the part she had completely failed to anticipate. She had always expected to be able to effortlessly answer it. At exactly 47 minutes past 6 o'clock on the evening of the dramatic hearing, Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez officially posted an image to her highly influential Instagram account. The carefully selected photograph featured a joyful moment captured during a massive, energetic campaign rally held in Queens back in 2019. It depicted her standing joyfully amidst a massive crowd, her arms triumphantly raised toward the sky, completely surrounded by screaming, adoring supporters, radiating the highly specific, intoxicating joy, exclusive to someone who has just miraculously won an impossible victory against overwhelming odds. The defiant caption positioned below the image read, "The establishment Republicans aggressively attack me entirely because they deeply fear exactly what I represent." A convenient digital link directing followers to donate money, was prominently featured. The massive fundraising email was officially blasted out exactly 40 minutes later. The Talons 9, aggressive subject line, loudly declared, "Powerful Republicans are absolutely terrified of me. Please chip in today to help me fight back." It successfully raised a staggering $2.1 million over the course of 24 hours. Her enthusiastic campaign manager confidently declared the aggressive maneuver an absolute, undeniable success. Her aggressive communications director confidently declared the massive financial haul to be absolute proof that her loyal political base remained deeply, fiercely energized. What the highly paid staff absolutely did not confidently call a success, however, and what they absolutely did not willingly share with the broader public, was the highly concerning internal data, strictly detailing exactly who was suddenly choosing not to donate their money. It was obviously not the conservative Republicans refusing to donate. Conservative Republicans had naturally never donated to her campaigns. It was obviously not her entrenched political opponents. Opponents never donated. The sudden glaring financial gap appearing in the data was entirely concentrated within one highly specific, incredibly vital demographic: young progressive women residing in New York City. Specifically, women falling between the ages of 22 and 34. The exact demographic that had proudly constituted the absolute bedrock of her most reliable, passionate, small-dollar donor base ever since her miraculous victory in 2018. That highly specific, deeply loyal demographic's financial contribution rate during the critical 24-hour period, immediately following the viral hearing, had suddenly plummeted by a staggering 31%, when directly compared to the exact same comparable period following her last major viral news cycle. Her brilliant young data director quietly noticed this terrifying statistical anomaly at exactly 10 o'clock. That evening, she absolutely did not verbally mention the alarming discrepancy to the enthusiastic campaign manager. She absolutely did not verbally mention the concerning numbers to absolutely anyone else on the staff. She simply sat quietly in front of her glowing monitor, staring at the terrifying Simma's mathematical reality for a very long while. And then she slowly, methodically wrote the devastating number down inside a private hidden notebook. And then she quietly packed her bag and went home for the night. Exactly 3 weeks following the explosive hearing, 3 separate political candidates officially filed the necessary bureaucratic paperwork to formally challenge Ocasio-Cortez in the upcoming 2028 Democratic primary election, specifically for New York's the 14th Congressional District. None of the 3 individuals who boldly stepped forward were considered massive, significant figures within the entrenched political establishment. 2 of the brave challengers were entirely first-time grassroots candidates. The third challenger was a highly respected, deeply passionate community organizer, hailing from the neighborhood of Jackson Heights, an individual who had been deeply actively involved in grassroots, local politics for over a decade, but who had fundamentally never possessed the courage to actively run for high elected office before this moment. None of the 3 challengers possessed access to significant financial resources, nor did they possess the backing of any powerful institutional apparatus. But regardless of those massive disadvantages, they officially filed their paperwork. And officially filing paperwork inherently costs valuable political capital. Rational political challengers simply do not blindly enter massive electoral races without possessing a profound underlying reason to do so. They certainly do not recklessly launch campaigns against a massively famous incumbent who routinely generates over $20 million in annual campaign fundraising. They certainly do not challenge an incumbent in a deeply loyal district, where that specific incumbent had effortlessly won her previous election by a staggering margin of 43 percentage points. They boldly filed their paperwork specifically because they had collectively sensed a profound, undeniable shift occurring beneath the surface. They possessed the highly specific, deeply attuned instinct, exclusive to individuals who spend the entirety of their waking lives operating incredibly close to the ground. Individuals who actively listen to the quiet, unvarnished conversations occurring daily inside local community centers, inside small neighborhood bodegas, inside echoing church basement halls, individuals who operate closely within the specific sacred places where ordinary exhausted people finally feel comfortable enough to softly articulate exactly what they genuinely think. Those highly attuned grassroots leaders had Papson of Semel of WTs in 7, collectively sensed a massive tectonic shift in the atmosphere. It was absolutely not a feeling of sudden, violent anger. It was absolutely not a feeling of vicious, cynical betrayal. It was vastly closer to the exact profound, melancholic feeling that Carlos Mendoza had quietly described to his son while standing in his small kitchen. The incredibly heavy weight of a massive, profound philosophical question that simply had not existed in the atmosphere before that fateful morning. A terrifying question, fundamentally demanding to know whether or not the beautiful, inspiring story was actually still true. Ocasio-Cortez's sophisticated campaign apparatus swiftly released a highly polished professional statement to the hungry press. The Congresswoman has consistently aggressively delivered vital resources for the hardworking people of the Bronx and Queens in highly tangible ways that eloquently speak for themselves. She enthusiastically welcomes the beautiful democratic process, and she has absolutely never, for a single moment, taken the vital support of her beloved constituents for granted. It was an undeniably excellent statement. It was meticulously professionally written. It was entirely flawlessly politically appropriate. Absolutely no major journalistic publication bothered to quote the statement anywhere, with the sole exception of a minor automated Democratic Party press release aggregator website. A seasoned political reporter finally managed to track down Mike Johnson as he was quietly walking through the grand echoing space of the Capitol Rotunda, exactly 2 days after the dramatic committee hearing had concluded. Speaker Johnson, the breathless reporter called out, matching his stride. 3 separate primary challengers have officially filed paperwork to run against Representative Ocasio-Cortez. Do you personally believe that the specific questions you asked her during the hearing fundamentally altered the political landscape of her district? Johnson slowly turned to look at the eager reporter, his face adopting the remarkably mild, unbothered expression of a quiet man hailing from Louisiana, who has absolutely never, in his entire life, found it politically useful or necessary to say anything more than what is strictly required. I assure you, I absolutely do not closely follow the internal dynamics of Democratic primary elections, he answered smoothly. That is entirely their own private business to manage. But do you personally believe that the specific line of questioning you pursued possessed a significant impact? The reporter pressed. I simply asked a sworn witness to provide clarity regarding her own documented record, Johnson replied evenly. That is exactly what congressional oversight hearings are fundamentally designed to accomplish. The viral video clip of your exchange has been viewed vastly more than 30 million times across the internet. At this point, the reporter continued aggressively. Furthermore, Jasmine Rivera's emotional response video, I honestly have absolutely no idea who that specific individual is. Johnson interrupted gently, which was, technically, not entirely true, but simultaneously, it was not entirely a falsehood either. She is a highly influential digital creator, hailing from the Bronx. She is a former passionate volunteer for AOC's campaign, the reporter rapidly explained. Her viral video, which specifically demands that Ocasio-Cortez honestly answer your core question, has currently, I am genuinely deeply glad that everyday American citizens are choosing to become actively engaged in the complex political process, Johnson stated calmly, cutting off the sentence. That kind of civic engagement is incredibly healthy for our republic. He politely turned his body and began to resume his walk across the rotunda. Just one final question. Speaker, the reporter called out, desperately. Do you personally believe that Representative Ocasio-Cortez is genuinely still the exact person she continuously claims to be? Johnson slowly stopped walking. He stood silently in the massive echoing space. He thought deeply about the profound question. Genuinely, visibly. He pondered it in the highly specific, deeply serious manner of an intellectual who, fundamentally does not believe in casually offering answers that he has not fully exhaustively considered. From every possible angle, I sincerely think that she originally came from an incredibly real, genuine place. He finally stated, his voice echoing softly against the marble walls. I completely believe that the reality of her humble background is entirely real. The difficult environment she grew up struggling within is entirely real. But he turned his gaze away from the grand architecture and looked directly into the reporter's eyes. I simply asked her a very basic, fundamental question. I asked whether or not the hard-working people residing in her home district genuinely still see a reflection of themselves shining within her, and her only. The response was to loudly tell me about how hard she fights. He paused, letting the silence stretch across the vast rotunda. The good, resilient people hailing from the Bronx intimately understand the profound difference between someone who is genuinely one of them and someone who merely fights for them from afar. They have witnessed a great many wealthy people arrive to fight for them over the long years. What originally made her so incredibly different, what made her specific narrative breathtakingly different, was the profound promise that she was supposed to actually be one of them. He looked thoughtfully down the incredibly long expanse of the echoing marble corridor as to the question of whether or not she actually still is. That is absolutely not my specific question. Answer. That monumental question entirely belongs to them. He slowly turned away and continued his quiet walk, disappearing into the labyrinth of the Capitol. Meanwhile, far behind him, situated deeply within the vibrant, chaotic streets of the Bronx, nestled within the bustling neighborhoods of Jackson Heights, deep within the exact vibrant communities where Jasmine Rivera had bravely grown up, and deep within the quiet apartment buildings where Carlos Mendoza exhaustively returned home after completing brutal 12-hour shifts. In absolutely all of those sacred everyday places, ordinary people were quietly staring at a glowing video clip. They brooded, were softly asking each other a terrifying, profound question. And they were slowly, painfully discovering that the comfortable, reassuring answer they had fully expected to easily give was suddenly arriving a little less easily than it used to. This hesitation absolutely did not manifest because they had suddenly magically transformed into conservative Republicans. It absolutely did not occur because they had cynically stopped believing in the noble progressive ideals she continuously claimed to champion. The hesitation existed simply because one quiet man hailing from the state of Louisiana, armed with absolutely nothing but one single folder and one incredibly profound question, had successfully, permanently identified the massive echoing gap existing between the beautiful political story and the brutal documented record. He had asked with absolute unshakable calmness inside a brightly lit room filled with high-definition cameras, whether or not anyone possessed the courage to honestly explain it. And she had simply loudly replied, "I have been fighting." And while that statement was undeniably factually true, it was absolutely fundamentally not the exact same thing. And absolutely every single exhausted person who had ever grown up nervously checking the balance of their bank account before daring to purchase basic groceries. Absolutely every single resilient person who had ever been forced to ride the exact same endlessly crowded subway trains. Every person who had survived on the exact same cheap dollar menu lunches. Every person who had watched their devoted parents willingly sacrifice absolutely everything they possessed, simply to secure a slightly better zip code for their children. Absolutely all of those beautiful, struggling people intimately, profoundly understood the devastating difference existing between those two concepts. They understood it in a deeply profound, bone-deep way that absolutely no slickly produced, aggressively worded political fundraising email could ever possibly hope to bridge, and that absolutely no meticulously crafted campaign press release could ever possibly hope to permanently close. The massive echoing gap was undeniably permanently there now. In truth, the gap had likely always been silently expanding there, hidden just beneath the surface. But now it had finally irrevocably been given a specific name. And unfortunately for the representative, devastating things that have finally been given a name absolutely do not possess the capacity to ever go back to being unnamed. The highly anticipated Restore Trust in Congress Act officially passed the House of Representatives exactly 4 months later, boasting massive protection, overwhelming bipartisan support. Representative Ocasio-Cortez proudly cast her official vote in favor of the legislation. Her affirmative vote was duly noted, politely appreciated, and thoroughly reported by the political press. The viral video clip of her dramatic oversight hearing was still continuously circulating across the digital landscape. Jasmine Rivera's raw emotional response video had eventually accumulated an astonishing 31 million total views. The three brave primary challengers were resolutely maintaining their grassroots campaigns, and quietly inside a small, brightly lit kitchen located deep within the South Bronx. An exhausted man who had proudly, enthusiastically voted for the exact same inspiring candidate of 4 consecutive times was standing completely still, thinking deeply. He was thinking absolutely not for the final time, and certainly not without a profound sense of melancholic care about the massive, devastating philosophical difference existing between a leader who intimately understands your difficult life, precisely because they have physically lived it alongside you, and a powerful politician who simply fights for your survival from an incredibly safe, luxurious distance. He had absolutely not yet made a final decision regarding exactly what he was ultimately going to do with the heavy weight of that